The Legend of Zelda is one of the most iconic series in all of gaming, and also happens to be my personal favorite. I've set out to rank every main series game and compile the ultimate Zelda series ranking. In this video, we are going back to where it all began with the Nintendo Entertainment System classic, The Legend of Zelda. We will be scoring the game across these 10 categories. Each category will be scored from 1 to 5, with 5 being the best. Each category score is being chosen in relation to the other games in the series. At the end, everything will be averaged out to get our final score. Also, make sure to stick around to the very end of the video where I'll reveal the next Zelda game review following this one. Now let's get started. Legend of Zelda's story is about as straightforward as it gets. So straightforward, in fact, that instead of summarizing it, I'm just going to read straight from the game's manual. A long time ago, the world was in an age of chaos. In the middle of this chaos, in a little kingdom in the land of Hyrule, a legend was being handed down from generation to generation. The legend of the Triforce, golden triangles possessing mystical powers. One day, an evil army attacked this peaceful little kingdom and stole the Triforce of Power. This army was led by Ganon, the powerful Prince of Darkness who sought to plunge the world into fear and darkness under his rule. Fearing his wicked rule, Princess Zelda, the princess of this kingdom, split the Triforce of Wisdom into 8 fragments and hid them throughout the realm, to save the last remaining Triforce from the clutches of the evil Ganon. At the same time, she commanded her most trustworthy nursemaid Impa to secretly escape into the land and go find a man with enough courage to destroy the evil Ganon. Upon hearing this, Ganon grew angry, imprisoned the princess, and sent out a party in search of Impa. Braving forests and mountains, Impa fled for her life from her pursuers. As she reached the very limit of her energy, she found herself surrounded by Ganon's evil henchmen. Cornered, what could she do? But wait! All was not lost. A young lad appeared. He skillfully drove off Ganon's henchmen and saved Impa from a fate worse than death. His name was Link. During his travels, he had come across Impa and Ganon's henchmen. Impa told Link the whole story of the Princess Zelda and the evil Ganon. Burning with a sense of justice, Link resolved to save Zelda, but Ganon was a powerful opponent. He held the Triforce of Power, and so, in order to fight off Ganon, Link had to bring the scattered 8 fragments of the Triforce of Wisdom together to rebuild the mystical triangle. If he couldn't do this, there would be no chance Link could fight his way into Death Mountain where Ganon lived. Can Link really destroy Ganon and save Princess Zelda? Only your skill can answer that question. Good luck, use the Triforce wisely. And then, that's pretty much it. You collect 8 pieces, go to Death Mountain, and defeat Ganon. So now for the score. Older games, particularly on the NES, are going to be tough. This game started literally one of the greatest game series ever, but we also have to look at the game through the lens of today, right? This is a long-winded way of saying 1 out of 5. Yeah, you heard it, 1 out of 5. Worst story ever. No, not really. Look, we have to keep in mind that these scores are relative to the other games in the series. Did this story set the table for a wonderful world that we continue to enjoy 35 years later? Of course, but we also have to keep in mind that we have come a long way. I believe the 1 out of 5 is justified because I truly believe every title that followed this game has had a better and more detailed story. Hyrule and Legend of Zelda is one of the strong points of the original game. It may be very small compared to map sizes of games like Breath of the Wild and Twilight Princess, but what it lacks in size it makes up for in how densely packed it is with things to discover. Putting aside the 9 dungeons that span across the map, we also have caves to discover that hold rupees, shopkeepers, sword upgrades, and heart containers. This is a map that really rewards you for checking every bush and bombing every wall. That might be a little too tedious for some, myself included, so even using a map, you'll be impressed with how much is going on in such a small space. Even being a filthy cheater like me and using a map, you'll find yourself planning out a strategy on how to best equip yourself for your next dungeon. This game's version of Hyrule also bursts some of the series' most famous landmarks, such as Death Mountain and the Lost Woods. The world gets a 4 out of 5. Though dated in appearance and size compared to later titles, the map in Legend of Zelda has so much to discover, and more often than not, what you find will be of great value. For anyone who is not an expert, it's nearly a requirement to scour every nook and cranny of the world to give you every possible advantage you can get. I said previously we have to score relative to all other games. Has pretty much every Zelda game since this one improved the graphics and art? Yes. I mean, the manual does have some really awesome original art, but I do feel like we have to leave that out. We just have to stay focused on the game itself for this specific category. I'm going to give the graphics and art a 2 out of 5. My reasoning behind this is that while the graphics do look worse compared to later titles, we have to give at least one additional point for nostalgia. 8-bit has a coolness factor, and if the art was really that bad, would we see so much merchandise that features the original Zelda art? I don't think so. So is it dated? Yes, but people still remember it fondly. The gameplay is where things get a little more rough. This is the first game, and the Zelda teams through the years have learned a lot since this game. Understatement of the century, I know. Going back and playing this game, the number one issue that's always hard to adjust is only being able to do that forward stab in whatever direction you're facing. Link's arcing slash motion in A Link to the Past became the staple for 2D Zeldas for every game going forward. After playing a half a dozen of those games in that style, the forward stab just feels so bad and unnatural. The other items in combat definitely feel better, like bombs and the fire rod. You're just way more comfortable at a distance. Anytime you're close and have to use your sword, it's just way too easy to get hit. As you might have expected, gameplay gets a 1 out of 5. At the end of the day, every Zelda, and I mean every mainline Zelda, just does the sword and item combat better. Bombs, boomerang, bow and arrow, musical instrument, they are all just Zelda. The original game created quite a few staples that have lived on to be in almost every single entry in the series. Bombs are pretty much the most important item in the entire game. There's quite a few necessary walls to bomb to complete the game, and they are the best item to dispose of enemies like Dark Nuts, as well as a few bosses. I love how you can just get bombs right away by either buying them or getting them from an enemy drop. They got it right the first time, seriously. Bombs are always so important in Zelda, I wish they would just give them to you early more often. At least they got that right in Breath of the Wild. The bow and arrow isn't quite as useful as it is in other games. It was an odd choice to have you buy arrows, but then it spends rupees every time you shoot it. My guess is it was a limitation of the NES console. The magic rod is an awesome weapon that will eventually replace your candle. You can sneak into Dungeon 8 early on to get the book and start spamming certain enemies with fire. It just feels great. On the other side, we have some items that feel more like gatekeeping than something useful. The raft is basically used twice in total, one for an item pickup and another for a dungeon entrance. The step ladder is necessary to progress in certain dungeons, but can sometimes be more trouble than it intends to be when you accidentally corner yourself near enemies. The items get a 3 out of 5. We have a very solid lineup with some great items that became staples in the Zelda series. We also have a few less interesting items that, unsurprisingly, didn't stick around too long after this game. The bombs, in my opinion, are a little too important. If you're an expert, it's probably not a problem, but for an amateur like me, they always feel like they are in short supply and they are necessary to have on hand a lot of times. Overall, the items are a mixed bag with some real gems mixed in, like the power ring to help you take less damage and sword upgrades to deal greater damage. In The Legend of Zelda, there are 9 dungeons scattered across Hyrule, all numbered, but each dungeon map is in a specific shape. We have maps like the dragon, the moon, the skull, and one that we're probably just not going to talk about.
Are we the baddies?
While they all look pretty much the same aside from some palette swaps, each dungeon is progressively more difficult. You, Dungeon 6, you and your whiz robes still haunt me in my dreams. The early dungeons are pretty easy to complete without any sort of guide, assuming you were able to locate them. Around Dungeon 5, things really start to pick up. The later dungeons are just a little too obnoxious in my opinion. The amount of bombable walls you need to find to progress is absurd. From Dungeon 6 onward, I was using a map because I just didn't have the patience to figure it out on my own. In this game, the dungeons all pretty much work the same though. You have rooms locked behind doors you need keys for, rooms where you kill everything, then push this block, rooms where you kill everything and then push this block, rooms where you kill everything and get an item, and so on. You start to see the patterns, and every dungeon basically works the same, but has harder enemies in a more obscure pathway. The dungeons get a 2 out of 5. It's a great start to what would become many people's favorite aspect of the series, but we have also come a long way. All the dungeons feel very much the same, with the later ones just having more BS mixed in to confuse you. Keys, ropes, like-likes, Stalfos, moblins. This is the origin of many iconic enemies. I think for the most part, the regular enemies hold up relatively well, except for the godforsaken Dark Nuts. My god, are they annoying in this game. If you're lucky or skilled enough to have bombs, then they are easy to deal with, but if you suck like me, you're gonna have a bad time. I feel like I understand their pattern, but in a room full of them, it's just really difficult to get your bearings and properly time each stab. The blue ones in particular really hurt, and anytime I'm required to clear a room of these guys, I cry every time. The first boss we have is Aquamentus. He's a bit of a pushover, but that's not exactly a bad thing for a first boss. Only problem is he's just recycled again as the boss of Dungeon 7, albeit a stronger version. Next we have Dodongos.
Great! I can't wait to bomb some Dodongos!
These guys are a little bit trickier. You don't have to worry about taking damage, it's more about not being stupid with your bombs. The Dodongos need to be facing the right way, otherwise it's just a total waste. You're probably only going to have 8 bombs at this point, or 8 bombs the whole game if you're lazy like me. 2 bombs to each of them, and they're done. Manhandla.
Whoa kid, you can manhandle Manhandla.
With 1 to 2 bombs, it's a complete f***ing joke. Gleeok can actually be pretty tough in the first encounter, and he took me a few tries. By the time you see him again as the main boss of level 6, yes, another recycled final boss, you can basically just absorb the damage and wail away at him. Digdogger is another complete joke once you know how to deal with it. I do like the fact that you actually have to use the dungeon item to defeat it though. Just play the recorder, and then just sword him to death. Early signs of the Zelda formula! Goma. The OG Goma looks more like a crab than a spider, but we still love it all the same. Blast him in the eye and GG. Finally we have Ganon himself. Definitely the most interesting fight. He's invisible and you basically have to blindly stab until you can catch him, and then shoot a silver arrow to finish him off. I'm rating the bosses a 1 out of 5. The regular enemies are fine, but for the most part, the vast majority of bosses are super underwhelming, a complete pushover, and they even recycle 2 of them as a final boss in a dungeon. Not to mention all the other bosses appearing as mini-bosses later on. Ganon is clearly the standout, but even that fight can be done in about 15 seconds, and f*** you Dark Nuts. For the side content, we don't exactly have extra missions to do or anything, it pretty much just comes down to the optional pickups and upgrades. While things like sword upgrades and heart containers are optional, they are nearly required for a casual player. We do have a couple things like the money-making game, potion shops, and stores too, but it's hardly content. Lastly, credit where it's due, there is an entire second quest that is more difficult and totally mixes up the dungeons. You won't find me playing it anytime soon, as I have enough trouble with the standard game, but it is there for those who want it. Side content gets a 2 out of 5. It's pretty much just a couple mini games and upgrades, but for the brave and skilled players, there is also an entire second quest to enjoy. This should be a quick one as there's only about 6 music tracks in the game that go beyond a few seconds. The most famous being the overworld theme, which would go on to be the main theme of the series and be in many titles going forward. The game over and ending credits themes are also very catchy, and who could not forget the epic and foreboding dungeon theme. I'm really surprised we haven't seen that dungeon theme return more often outside of a cameo in Majora's Mask. Lastly, I think the theme in level 9 in the final dungeon is just okay, not nearly as memorable as the other tracks. The music gets a 3 out of 5. There's a couple really iconic tracks in this game, but there's so few that I really can't give it a higher score than a 3. Lastly, we come to pacing and progression. The Legend of Zelda is a very straightforward experience. No fluff. Get the sword and go start finding items and raiding dungeons. There's no padding in between dungeons, you can prepare as much or as little as you want for each one. This is the type of progression I really appreciate. The only thing that really holds it back is how difficult it can be to figure out where the next dungeon is, and sometimes where to go inside of a dungeon. If you're like me and have no qualms about using a guide, then the game moves along really nicely. If you're trying to get through the game without a guide, you're likely going to get really frustrated unless you have the patience of a saint. Pacing and progression gets a 4 out of 5. The Legend of Zelda's open approach to exploration and completing dungeons is still an experience that holds up well, provided you have the tools to help you along the way. This formula was so well done, it's no surprise that the series finally found its way back to this approach in Breath of the Wild. I'm deducting 1 point with how frustrating and exponentially more difficult the progression can be if you're trying to complete this game with absolutely no help. So we've gone through every category, and here is the recap of each of the scores. The scores averaged out to a final score of a 2.3 out of 5, our lowest score so far. We covered the Wind Waker and Phantom Hourglass in a previous video, so here's where we stand with all 3 games. As we rate each game, we will continue to populate this list and slowly build the Ultimate Zelda series ranking. Make sure to let me know in the comments how you would score each of the categories for the original Legend of Zelda. Now for what game we're reviewing next? I wonder. Thank you guys for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe.